Welcome. In this video, we're going to explore the concept of the self and discovering the self. And the first thing to differentiate is that the self is not the identity. The identity, otherwise known as the ego, is the repetitive pattern, the self-referential pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that we use to identify ourselves. If we look in the mirror and say, is that me? What we ask ourselves as we answer the question is, does it look like me? That's the first thing. And often that's enough. But if we look further, does it sound like me? I'm not myself. Does it sound like me? Now, how do we know if it sounds like me? Well, we remember. We go back into the past. We remember. And then we compare. We say, this is what I sound like now. That's what I sounded like then. So it must be me. Well, how do you know that that's you? Just because what's there is doing whatever it was doing before. Well, we say, well, do I think the same thoughts that I thought yesterday? And if I'm thinking the same thoughts that I thought yesterday, then it must be me. Well, how do I know that that was me? Well, I was thinking the same thoughts yesterday that I thought before that. In other words, the main way that we tell if someone is us is whether there is a continuity of pattern repetition in the arenas of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And that's why both a cult and an ego, a fractal representation of the cult, are self-referential. Because we don't answer the question, is it me, based on whether I'm thinking the most intelligent thought. That would be nice. That must be me because I'm doing the most intelligent thing that I could be doing to generate sustainable well-being. I'm consuming less energy to deliver higher levels of sustainable well-being. That must be me because I'm intelligent. No, we say I watched that TV show before, now I'm watching that. So it would be nice if there was a correlation between a cult and intelligence, between the identity or ego and intelligence. But in fact, it's mostly a self-referential loop. And hopefully, if we have an examined life, we remember also how we got there. Like, why did I choose to say this versus that? And so, there's some, there's some awareness of arriving at the identity consciously. But the identity is not the self. So what is the self? Have we ever met the self? And what's this distinction between the identity and the self that has an identity? Well, one of the differentiations is between the witness and the identity. So the witness witnesses the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors, etc. But in order to witness something, there must be a differentiation, a distinction between the one who witnesses and the one who is being witnessed, basically. And so the witness is closer to the sense of self. Now, another distinction is that the self is interconnected with the entire fabric of all that is, whereas the identity is distinct. One of the reasons that there is identity politics, identity clashes, identity warfare, wars in general are wars between identities. They're not wars between selves. They're wars between identities. I think this, and you think that. Why don't you think what I think? Well, why don't you think what I think? Well, you should think what I think. Well, you should think what I think. And then they say, well, let's have a battle. Let's fight and see, whose way of thinking prevails. So this is a war of identity. It can be a war of words. It can be a war of money. It can be a war of all kinds of things. And in identity wars, the variables are mass and intelligence. And so intelligence has something to do with efficiency. The ultimate intelligence is measured by the efficiency with which energy is transformed into sustainable well-being. And so the ultimate intelligence has a lot to do with efficiency. But even if you're a sociopath, surviving, if you can leverage your offense and defense to yield more effective offense and defense, then you are going to have a better chance of winning the battle, right? So again, tying in with efficiency. But in this framework of a clash of identities, the witness does not identify with the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. The witness witnesses the patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, and witnesses the interconnectivity between the identity and the underlying ecology out of which the identity emerges. The underlying ecology is similar to the mycelial network of all these different things out of which the visible form of the mushroom appears. The mushrooms look distinct until you see the mycelial network underneath the ground. That is not only connecting, the various mushrooms, but is connecting the mushrooms with the environment, and often connecting one tree to another there's all kinds of different communication that's going through these different networks, much like an internetwork, a fiber network out there. You have fiber networks of fungi, etc., under the ground. And so the self is an awareness that is bigger than the identity, which is what allows it to witness the identity. And Buddhism, of the various global cultures, most celebrates the witness by encouraging the development of a space between. Stephen Covey in The 7 Habits articulates this as the gap between stimulus and response. That to the extent that we are a human being, to the extent that we have agency and freedom, to the extent that we have power to consciously alter our environment, is to the extent that we own and enter the space between stimuli and response. That to be truly masterful, we must be able to take any stimuli and freely respond to it as we desire, in the means and in the way that would allow us to create our desired outcome, not the reactive outcome that emerges from a trigger, from a stimuli. That this is what separates us from an animal, is the space between stimuli and response. And so the self exists in that space, or we are aware of the self. We cultivate and invite the self into our life by expanding the gap between stimuli and response. And this is also, of course, the distinction between reaction and proaction. That we have a reaction, we evaluate the reaction, and then we take a different reaction. We insert an edit in the code. And the one that's inserting the edit in the code is the one who is aware that they are aware, is the self. Now, the self is, of course, bigger than the identity. It's also interconnected with a number of identities, because the self can witness the ecology and in its way own its relationship and its connection, because all relationships speak of a flow of energy and a flow of patterns back and forth. That's what a relay is. Relay. It's a flow back and forth. It's a breath in and out. And the self is the one that witnesses the flow between our body and the larger ecology that gives birth to it and sustains it, between our mind and the larger cult mind that gives rise to it and sustains it. There's an awareness of self, and we can cultivate that awareness if you will find the one who is reacting to everything that I'm saying, and then if you will find the one who witnesses. And the Buddhists have this wonderful kind of process of the bell. That the bell is about breaking the spell, the state of immersion in the pattern to, can we find the one that hears the sound? And can we find the one who witnesses hearing the sound? And can we find the self of the self, the one who witnesses, the one who witnesses? Because reality is fractal in nature, which means that if there is an identity, that is the individual cell of humanity, then there's also an identity that is the individual family. And there's an identity that is the group, the community. And there's an identity that is the species. And there's an identity that is the planet. And there's an identity. And so there's a fractal pattern, and it just goes on and on and on. That our universe in the multiverse, that our multiverse in the multiverse of multiverses, that it just keeps going on. And you can follow energy down to subatomic particles, because that's just as far as we can look now with our current observing and measuring devices. And we can follow it up into our universe, because that's just where we look in the framework of what we can see in our mathematics and telescopes. Every unit, every device for observing and measuring reveals something a little different. There is, in a sense, an innate relationship between the observing and measuring device, for example, thoughts and thinking, is an observing and measuring device. To think a thought and then think a thought about thinking a thought is using thought to observe and measure thought. But if you use thought to observe and measure thought, you get a different experience than if you use feelings to observe and measure thoughts, or sensation to observe and measure thoughts. And those are what we kind of have in our toolkit. We have thoughts, and we have feelings, and we have sensations. So everything that we experience as reality is some mix and overlay of thinking, feeling, and sensing, sensation, that is creating a synergy, this multidimensional experience of energy through the observing and measuring devices. And it's absolutely incredible, all the ways that thoughts, feelings, and senses can be refracted to create all of the different renditions of reality. That's what we do all the time, to experience that. So the self is the one who witnesses that recipe, that mix of thoughts, feelings, and senses, which create through paradigms and beliefs the patterns that we see around us. Is the universe a friendly place? It is if we believe it and look for it. Is the universe a hostile and cruel place? It is if we believe it and look for it. Our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs, our paradigms influence what we see, in part because our senses, scientists tell us, deliver 50% more data than we can consciously track. So our senses deliver 100% of the data. Like right now, I'm focusing on a very, very tiny bit of all of my senses data. There's a light up there, but I haven't been thinking about that for this entire time. There's an interesting bit of artwork over there, but you and I aren't looking at that. We're looking at this. We're wrapped up in this concept, in this focus through language, the wrapping of reality through language, the interpretation of reality through language, the ultimate mental technology. And so the self is beyond the identity, and it is linked to other selves that are also bigger and beyond the identity. The concept of the divine, of God, Goddess, all that is the concept of the ultimate, the biggest that we can imagine, because it keeps going on in a fractal pattern. It's infinite, and it's infinite, and it's infinite, and it's infinite. But God is what we call the biggest identity that we can imagine. But of course, we're a very small part of reality, so why would we be able to imagine the entirety, an identity that is beyond our imagination? But why should the fractal pattern of reality stop at the limits of our imagination? And what are the beings, what are the identities, the selves, that are bigger than we are? We don't know, but if we understand the fractal nature of reality, we know that we are a small part of that self, and hence the truth that we are a very, very, very tiny part of God, Goddess, all that is. Because like an individual cell among billions of cells within the body. We are an individual cell of this aspect of reality. And just as there is a self that witnesses our identity, if we project the fractal nature of reality out there, then there is a self that witnesses our self, and a self that witnesses that. And somewhere in that point where we reach the edge of our frame, you say, this is the frame of human consciousness, the frame of paradigm, the frame of this video. And it's a good frame because we can digest a lot of what goes on in this frame. We can focus within the frame. But of course, 99.99% of all reality is outside the frame. It's out there. And it's not empty. It's not lonely. It's not a void beyond the line that we can see. It's filled with energy. And that energy takes shape in part by the observing and measuring devices we use to measure it. So is it filled with loving energy? Or is it filled with hate and despair? It partly depends on a couple of things. One of them is this polarity between love and hate and despair. We invent these polarities that split reality in half. And of course, all polar opposites are closely linked. So we split reality into two halves, yin and yang, up and down. We're doing that with language, right? Because in fact, they're interconnected. You cannot have black without white and white without black. They're deeply connected. So whether you focus on the black or the white, it's a very personal decision at some level. And at another level, it's not personal at all. It's about what's going on in the ecology around you. It's nothing to do with you. It's everything to do with you. It's nothing to do with you. It's everything to do with you. Which do you focus on? So, the self is, of course, bigger than the identity. And God, Goddess, all that is, of course, bigger than the self. It's the edge of the frame that we can track, what we can imagine, and it just goes on endlessly outside of there. One of the most interesting things is the discovery that we are not the identity, that there is something more true, more beautiful, more good, more whole that lies outside the boundary of the identity. It's so exciting to discover that the biased, asymmetrical ego as a fractal representation of a biased and asymmetrical cult doesn't define the self that witnesses that asymmetry, that fractal representation, that evolutionary step, because cults oscillate between the polarities that they create. If a polarity of a cult is created of good and bad, then the cult oscillates between being good and bad. Because if we look at the pedal movement of walking. If you divide the one into two and turn that into legs, the way forward is to alternate between the two poles, and then you move forward. You must alternate. If your poles are good and bad, right and left, yin and yang, black and white, you have to alternate in order to move forward in relationship with the ecology. And so the cult oscillates back and forth, and the egos within the cult, the identities within the cult, oscillate largely with the cult. Although within the developmental process, you have sympathy, antipathy, synthesis, the unconscious merging with the cult, the unconscious reaction or antipathy towards the cult, and the synthesis of the adult. And so within the framework of a maturing ego or identity, you have the blind acceptance of the child, the reactionary rejection of the adolescent, and then the movement towards some sense of awareness in the space in between. It's in that space in between the adult that the self is most present. It's in the adult that the self is most present. So let's take a moment. Let's take a moment to see, because one of the most interesting things that I discovered in and through psychedelic mushrooms, psilocybe cubensis, I think is the Latin name for one of the more common mushrooms, is the gap between the normal identity and the liberated identity. Because what psilocybin does is it shuts down the default mode network. It reduces blood to the habitual patterns of identity. And what emerges in the stillness, in the void, in the liberation of an uncultured brain for a period of a few hours, what emerges is more intelligence, more grace. Because what emerges is more symmetry. You have the archetype of the undifferentiated whole. And as soon as the cult influence is restored by sending blood back to the default mode network, the cult is always training and rewarding its egos, its identities, for copying it. Because a cult's primary job is to create and sustain a cohesive pattern of identity that the members of the cult can recognize and use to anchor to the known, to protect against the fear of the void, the unknown, the feminine, of chaos, to anchor to the known, to protect against the unknown. The unknown is always bigger than the known. And so in the fear of the unknown, it stems from a certain fear that the universe isn't a friendly place. And so to enter its bigness is a little bit vulnerable. And so the mushroom just slows the blood down a little bit. And the circle returns because it is the nature of reality to be graceful. It is the nature of reality to be spherical, which is the most graceful shape there is. It's the most symmetrical. And symmetry ties into grace. It's why we have round wheels for our cars rather than square wheels, or half moons, right? What a violent ride that would be to drive around on half moons. But that is our cult, a violent ride, driving around on half moons, a cult that emphasizes so much of the masculine and sublimates and shames so much of the feminine. And so we're driving on 4 asymmetrical wheels, and it feels painful. And so we say the universe is painful. But why not restore the circle? Why not fill in the void and make the sphere whole? Because to do so is to threaten the identity, the pattern of the cult. And so as the self recedes, as the sphere interacts with the cult, certain parts of the sphere are amplified because they are rewarded for being bigger, and certain parts are shrunk because they are punished for existing. And in doing so, the sphere becomes watermelon and crescent moon, and life becomes hard. Life becomes frightening because there's all these energies out in the world that want to bring the sphere back to wholeness. And when one's greatest fear is fear of the unknown, which all traumatized cults produce large numbers of egos who have as their greatest fear the fear of the unknown, linked closely, because if you are truly in the unknown, you do not have control, so it's linked closely with the fear of being out of control, which is linked closely to the fear that the universe is an unfriendly place. Because if the universe was filled with abundance and surprise, then being out of control is no problem at all. But if the universe is filled with horrible things, then the most terrifying thing you could possibly imagine would be being out of control. And the most dangerous arena to be in, if you want to avoid being out of control, is the unknown. And so the cult continuously reinforces, rewards its members for coming back into the known terrain, and punishes its members for looking at anomalous data. But over here, it seems like this challenges the cult. It seems like that's not true at all. But that's given a little bit of a slap on a wrist or more fierce treatment if the cult member, if the minority doesn't come back to the herd, to where it's safe, because we know everything here because it's repetitive, and it's repetitive because we think and feel and believe and do the same things every single day, and we define ourselves as the pattern of repeating energy, of repeating thoughts, feelings, words, actions, and being. And so we feel very comfortable in our known terrain. The self is the one that shines through that witnesses that. The self is also the one who loves. The self is not imprisoned in the ego, and so the self is not in pain. The ego is often separate. The pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is by its very nature separating. Because if I'm thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being this, and this other cult and its members are thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing that, then we're separate. So the identification with distinct patterns is innately connected with separation. And distinction and separation generates the unknown, the unfamiliar. You're different from me. You're separate from me. So the fear of separation, the fear of loneliness, is ultimately the ego's greatest fear, is also produced by the ego. The greatest pain is the pain of being separate from the whole, of being cast out of the garden. Well, what is the garden? The garden is the great ecology, the great awareness of interconnectivity. Now, if we follow the narrative of the Big Bang, if we follow the genesis of all life, what we find is our current magicians tell a story of how everything began with this little bit of energy, exploded into the world and developed in this way and this way and this way and this way. It exploded into the world and developed in all of these different ways. And then this became this, and this subdivided and became this and this. And we see the same thing in the birth of a human being. There's a single cell organ, and it divides and becomes two, and the two become four, and then they start specializing. And slowly the human being emerges as a fractal representation of the species. The whole history of the universe, starting with this little pea, is relived in the generation of a human body. But there is an innate interconnectivity. One can follow the path of a human being all the way back to that cell. And one can follow the path of that back to both parents. And one can follow the path of both parents back to the first human being. There is an innate mathematical link on multiple dimensions between every single human being and the first human being. And there's an innate link between the first human being and the animal patterns out of which they emerged, through which they took shape. And there's a connection between those animal patterns and many, many, many millions and billions of iterations, all the way back to plant material. And there's a connection between the plant material back. It goes all the way back to the Big Bang, to the big birthing of a multiverse. And we are connected innately to that very original seed. And yet, through the lens of the identity, we seem to be separate from everything and anything in all ways. My nose is different than your nose. I want to wake up at 6 a.m. You wake up at 4:30. Everything is different. My fingers are 3 millimeters bigger than your fingers. You like 20% more butter on your toast. Every single thing. We're different. I'm completely separate, is the experience of the ego measuring itself in relationship with every other pattern. But that's not the self. The self is the one that watches the energy flowing from one pattern to another, that watches someone's joy reach out, touch another person, bring about a smile, and migrate from them to another person. The self is the one who witnesses. And what is most innate at a mathematical level is that all patterns, all identities, all patterns of energies are connected in an ecology that they cannot separate. That California cannot exist in its current state without Utah. That America cannot exist in its current state without Canada. That the Earth cannot exist in its current state without the sun. That the sun cannot exist in its current state without this galaxy, this universe. that there is a thread that connects all things mathematically on multiple dimensions. And the self is the one that celebrates, that is beyond the fear that is caught up in the identity. The I of repetitive thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. The self is the one that is free of that, because it is the one that witnesses that. And when you find that freedom, the one who watches, the one who loves, because what is love? Is it not an honoring of the other? Is it not an honoring of the relationship? What is love, if not an acknowledgement, an attunement to impact from one identity to another? To the truth, the highest truth, meaning if you look from 25 billion years perspective, when you look at 200 million light years and look down, the highest truth is that all things are connected in multiple ways. That there is one universe expressed in a trillion different distinct patterns, all in relationship with one another. That there's one organism, one complex pattern of energy with many subsets of patterns of energy. And what is love if not the honoring of that truth, the acknowledgement, the remembrance that I am a part of you, that you are a part of me, that we were once a single cell called the multiverse before it existed. And then we were the single cell of the multiverse as it first came into being. And then as it exploded into diversity, we were that diversity. And as it separated and iterated over time, we were once all of that. And this little identity on this little area of time-space is far removed from that magnificent moment. It's far removed only because of the blinders created by the observing and measuring devices of these senses. But the self does not wear those blinders. The self witnesses the relationship of this pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being in relationship with larger patterns of ecological energy. It witnesses a small part of what is, but an essential defining part of the self that is bigger than language, because the self watches thoughts which occur in language, is love. The honoring and acknowledgement that we are a part of everything else, and that everything else is a part of us. And thus comes the Buddhist way of walking with respect, of an awareness that if everything is connected, and if life and existence is sacred, then all things within the container, within the umbrella of existence are sacred. That this is sacred in its blackness, and this is sacred in its light, and that one creates the other. This walk, this meditation, is enlightenment. Now, enlightenment is removing the tunnel vision, is transcending the identity. I am the one who thinks this and feels this and says this and does this and is this way, sounds this way, looks this way. This is me. I am wrapped in isolation by the observing and measuring devices I use to define me. Enlightenment is opening the cocoon, is opening the prison, is letting energy penetrate the prism of identity to reveal a trillion different colors flowing from one part of the ecology through us into another, to reveal the multi-dimensional interconnected web that contains the identity we pretend through language's illusion is separate. Enlightenment is returning to the grace of that awareness that all things are within and that we are within all things. In other words, all things are connected in multiple different ways. To return to oneself is to return to the awareness, pre-prism, pre-cocoon, and to begin to co-create, to bridge the gap between the I identity and the larger identity, the I pattern of repetitive thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, and the ecological pattern of existence. There is no separation. Enlightenment is the penetration of the veil that obscures our interconnectivity with God, Goddess, all that is, between the ego and the reality out of which it emerges. Hi, I'm Dane Rose. All knowledge begins with a paradigm, and out of that paradigm comes an idea, an awareness that we adopt, reject, or synthesize into something better. It doesn't become wisdom, it doesn't become useful until we take action, until we integrate it into not only our thoughts, but our feelings, our body, our words, and our way of being. For that to occur, we have to move from the passive media paradigm into more active engagement. In the link below, in the More Information section, is an invitation to join a very small, deliberately filtered, high-quality discussion with a group of people who share a common language and want to work with these ideas, with me and with one another, with the sole goal of creating 10 times more sustainable well-being for ourselves and those around us per unit of energy invested. Thank you for watching.